the return of the late night boys. Welcome to the Pod People, the show where people are in pods.
Return of the pod.
Return of the pod. I'm the great red-bearded dragon, Matisse Van Rossum.
And I'm the Tooth Fairy, Ben Sheets.
And we did it. We survived Hurricane Florence. We lost everything. We're coming at you from a raft in what remains of North Carolina. All that survived was the 8-track tape recorder that we're recording this on now. And when we're finished, I'm gonna wrangle a seagull and tie that tape to it and have it fly right onto the internet.
Yeah, we're really innovating, changing the game, so to say.
Storm Surge boys. We are coming at you this week with a dual review of Manhunter and Red Dragon, both based on the Hannibal Lector novel Red Dragon by Thomas Harris, or what established the character of Hannibal Lector. We're gonna do something slightly different from our norm this time, and we're going to talk about both movies at the same time, kind of, instead of doing one after the other, because narratively they're pretty close to identical and both relatively faithful to their source material. So I don't think we really need to go one at a time. I think we'd be a little bit redundant in a lot of respects.
The approaches to what they're covering are so different. You know, Manhunter is directed by Michael Mann, who I would say is one of the better American directors of all time. Did movies like Heat, the Miami Vice remake, which is actually really good. He did Thief. Collateral, which is amazing. But yeah, he's a great director. And on the flip side, Red Dragon is directed by meme king Brett Ratner.
Yeah, who I guess is doing a biopic about Hugh Hefner starring Jared Leto. So that's guaranteed to be a train wreck.
That's just so sleazy. Wasn't he like Me Too'd?
He was. Yeah,
and now he's doing a hef.
And the funny thing is that the film was announced almost immediately after Hugh Hefner was Me Too'd.
Ooh.
So they were basically just like, oh, everybody hates Hef now. We're making a biopic. They just like doubled down.
Yeah.
Also, Jared Leto is Hugh Hefner.
Oof, God, that sounds like the worst movie. The AV Club, whenever they post a story, even tangentially related to Brett Ratner, the picture they use every time is Brett Ratner holding this giant coffee table book called The Big Book of Butts, and he's reading it, and behind him is just a shelf full of those books. And I think it sums up Brett Ratner better than anything I could say.
Yeah, the basic narrative of these two films is retired police detective Will Graham is contacted by Jack Crawford of the FBI, his old mentor, to ask for help in catching a new serial killer that they call the Tooth Fairy, who every full moon kills a whole family and like puts mirrors in their eyes and shit. And so to do this, Will Graham enlists the help of Hannibal Lector, who he put behind bars, but only after Hannibal stabbed him something nasty and almost killed him. So, as we said before, this is the first incarnation of Hannibal Lector. The book, Red Dragon, came out in 1981, I believe, and it was followed up by Silence of the Lambs and Hannibal, and then Hannibal Rising, all of which I read in high school and really enjoyed, except for Hannibal Rising. That one was kind of wonky.
Yeah, I've heard the books are really good.
The first three are excellent. I could not recommend them more.
Yeah, well, Let's start at the beginning. One of the big differences between the two films are Will Graham retired because, he arrested Hannibal, but in the process, was almost killed by Hannibal. Graham has some PTSD from that, essentially.
Yes, which is what forced him to retire.
Yeah. And the two films portray this very differently. Manhunter, they don't show any of the stuff with Lecter at all. In fact, they don't even mention it, really. They don't even mention cannibalism, even.
I think
they don't mention specifics of what happened.
I think we see cannibalism in some news clippings about Hannibal or something. Like, it's mentioned once or twice, but it's not really central.
Yeah. Instead, they focus on the PTSD of Will Graham more. He's kind of just zonked out, like half awake, kind of zombified throughout the movie, and then he'll snap into moments of high energy and high anger.
Yeah.
Which I thought was a really cool portrayal of PTSD, because a lot of the moments he pushed into higher energy was when he was in a space with images or screens.
Yeah, depicting violence.
Usually. Yeah, or, things of the case. The Brett Ratner version, on the flip side, they directly show Will catching Hannibal. They get in like a very violent confrontation within the first couple minutes of the movie.
Yeah, that's how Red Dragon starts, is with Will Graham catching Hannibal. It's sort of by accident because, Hannibal was his psychiatrist and he was sort of like bouncing case ideas off of him. So Hannibal was like a confidant. So that's another layer to the whole thing, is that like Hannibal was somebody that he trusted and confided in, and then it turns out he was the killer that he was hunting the whole time. So there's that dynamic as well. So they know each other very well. And he sort of goes back to Hannibal reluctantly, because like Hannibal is obviously the main trigger of his PTSD, but he knows that his insight is invaluable.
Yeah, and I think that kind of adds something. I think on one hand, I like that what that added to the complexity of the character. On the other hand, I think it removed the layer, any sort of subtlety that Manhunter had with the PTSD.
Well, yeah, no, the story is the same, but yeah, I agree how they approach that is totally different. Whereas Red Dragon has like actual flashbacks where we see what happened. Manhunter, the only time we finally learn the circumstances behind Will Graham catching Hannibal is when he's in the grocery store with his son and he explains it to him. And it's just like one shot on his face the whole time as he's explaining, rather than like flashing back and showing us. And I think that's actually a more effective way to do it, especially because William Peterson, who plays Will Graham in Manhunter, is really intense. He's got this really intense energy, even when he is kind of like you said, sort of zonked out and like diffident. He's still got that intensity. And I think that scene in Red Dragon, even though it's just one shot of the character's face, or Manhunter, sorry, even though it's just one shot of the character's face, it's much more effective than the flashback of Red Dragon.
Yeah.
In comparison, in Red Dragon, Will Graham is played by Edward Norton.
Yeah, and I mean, Edward Norton is a great actor. I like him in a lot of things.
Yeah, I do too.
But I think he didn't quite do as good of a job as William Peterson. And
I
mostly
don't think so
that can be put on the direction he got. Because I feel like, he was giving it his all, but like, it didn't really feel like he had PTSD in the same way.
No, it didn't. He lacked that intensity that I was talking about with William Peterson. Also, it doesn't focus as much on him in Red Dragon as it does in Manhunter. In Manhunter, like, Will Graham is very much like the central character, and we get much more development with him than we do with like Hannibal Lecter or Francis Dollarhide. Whereas in Red Dragon, it's kind of divided between the three. And I like that in the respect that we get more insight into Francis Dollarhide in Red Dragon, but a lot of the Will Graham stuff feels like an afterthought, kind of.
I like the focus that Manhunter brought to it. I think one of the big things, especially with the Hannibal stuff, is we're looking at a pre and post Silence of the Lambs interpretation of Red Dragon.
Yeah.
So, like, Manhunter, is pre-Silence of the Lambs.
It was
Hannibal
in 86,
Lecter,
like 5 years after the book
it
came
was
out.
before Hannibal Lecter was a household name. And so, in Manhunter, Hannibal Lecter is in, like 9 minutes of the movie?
Yeah, like 2 or 3 scenes.
Yeah, he has a very small role. It's kind of a pivotal role.
Yeah, it's important, but it's not about him.
Yeah, it's not about him. It's very understated, to say the least. Brian Cox plays Hannibal in Manhunter, and he does it in a very mundane manner, almost. It feels very everyday, which I actually like because, it kind of hits a good juxtaposition between the things he does and kind of the deviousness of the character.
Yeah, Brian Cox has said that Michael Mann told him to play the character like an English schoolboy, so he based his performance on like his 15-year-old son at the time or something like that. Whereas in Red Dragon, which came out in 2002, 10 years after Silence of the Lambs, and we got the Hannibal film in between, it's very much Anthony Hopkins doing the same Hannibal shtick, like doing it really dramatically.
Down to
which is
T.
Which is like, don't get me wrong, like, Anthony Hopkins is Hannibal Lecter. He does a great Hannibal Lecter, but in Red Dragon, it is just like, okay, this is a character that we're familiar with and that we know, and he has something like 25 minutes of screen time in Red Dragon. There's multiple scenes of Will Graham going back to him.
Yeah.
Where in Manhunter, the two of them are only in one scene together, and then the other 2 Hannibal scenes are without Will Graham.
Yeah, and I would also argue that Hannibal feels a little more threatening in Manhunter than he does in Red Dragon. And the reason I say that is in Manhunter, he's played in such an understated manner that it's almost like a wolf in sheep's clothing, where you don't expect it and it becomes creepier and more imposing because of that. Whereas in Red Dragon, Anthony Hopkins does a great job, but the reason why Hannibal Lecter is so imposing in Silence of the Lambs is because he's super unpredictable and he actually does stuff.
Yeah.
Whereas in this movie, Hannibal is, he's still imposing, but he's in his cell the whole time.
Well, and the introductory scene with him in Red Dragon is shot almost the exact same way that Clarice Starling's is in Silence of the Lambs, like down to the like getting closer to their faces and the shot reverse shot. Like, it's almost identical. And the dialogue in that scene is actually also almost identical in Red Dragon between the two of them. And I'm pretty sure they pulled that straight from the book. I haven't read those books since high school, but I'm pretty sure that dialogue is straight from the source material. It would make sense for both those movies to pull that then.
It felt so fan servicey, and
which I had never really noticed before. It's been a long time since I've seen Red Dragon.
It kind of removes the tension of the Hannibal character in Red Dragon, because he becomes that iconic character more than this is a very threatening, scary character.
Right.
You know?
I wonder what audiences thought of that character in Manhunter when it first came out, like you said, Hannibal Lecter being a household name. Like, we obviously weren't alive in 86 when this came out, so we can only look at this with the hindsight of knowing the character Hannibal Lecter as portrayed by Anthony Hopkins.
Well, that's the thing, too. I think a lot of people wouldn't even have thought of it too much. He's only in such a short amount of the movie that, like, while he does a great job and is very threatening,
he's kind of an afterthought.
Yeah, he's not the focus of the movie at all. From what I've read, I think Hannibal Lecter is only in like 12 pages or so of the original book. Of course, he's referenced a little bit more than that, but like, so I think it's somewhat accurate to the book in terms of amount of time is portrayed.
Well, I mean, when they made Manhunter, they would have only had that one book as reference too, because Silence of the Lambs, the novel, wasn't even written until 88, 2 years after Manhunter came out. I do think it's interesting that apparently David Lynch was first attached to direct Manhunter.
I think that would have been really interesting to see a Lynchian version of this.
It would have been way more surreal for sure, because that was David Lynch in like his peak in the mid 80s.
It would have been like a proto Twin Peaks.
Yeah, that was in like the Elephant Man and Blue Velvet era of Lynch. And I honestly would love to see Manhunter as directed by David Lynch. I think it would be really interesting. But he dropped out for some reason. I can't remember exactly why. And apparently Dino De Laurentiis, in sort of like a panic to find a new director for this movie, picked Michael Mann because his last name sounded like the title, which is a really weird way to choose a director for a movie, but worked out because Michael Mann is a really good director.
I find that really funny. I think just the idea of, hey, I know a director.
We're making Manhunter. What about this Michael Mann guy? He could do Manhunter. Manhunter. Get him on the phone.
A coked out Dino De Laurentiis. That story is great though. I think Lynch would do a great job with this material, but I really do like what Michael Mann brought to the table with it, because I think his pairing of these kind of neon flourishes with a very grounded realism works really well for the material.
Yeah, I liked it a lot too, especially in the nighttime scenes at Will Graham's house in Florida. Like, it took me a while to figure out whether, like, because it's so like saturated blue, I couldn't tell if they were doing like day for night with like a blue filter on the film in post, or whether it was just blue neon. And I guess it was blue neon, but like it's so stylized as compared to Red Dragon. Like, Brett Ratner shot that very much like standard early 2000s like Hollywood action drama. I mean, it looks fine. It's not badly shot or anything, but there's very little style to it, I think, in a lot of the scenes. Some are more stylistic than others, but as compared to like Michael Mann's, direction, there's many more like characteristic flourishes that I think make Red Dragon or Manhunter stand out more so than Red Dragon.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because while it does have those very pastel-y, bright flourishes in terms of color in Manhunter, the way it's shot is almost clinical at times,
which I think is appropriate for
Yeah.
an investigation-based police drama.
Yeah, I think so as well. But in comparison, Red Dragon is kind of ugly in comparison, but it's very movement oriented. You have lots of moving cameras, lots of
Yeah, it's a lot grimier, that's for
Yeah.
sure. But that's also, I think, a product of the decades that these movies were made in, where you have the 80s, which has a lot of neon and hyper stylization, and then like the early 2000s, where everything had to look gross, which is something that we're still kind of in to different extents. But, and then, you know, it works for some films over others, but Manhunter is definitely nicer to look at than Red Dragon, that's for sure.
One of the characters that I did like a little bit better in Red Dragon, and this is probably just the acting, is the journalist that Dollarhide abducts.
Oh yeah, Freddie Lounds.
Yeah, Philip Seymour Hoffman plays him in Red Dragon, and he does a really fantastic job. I mean, it's Philip Seymour Hoffman, so like...
Yeah, I mean, Philip Seymour Hoffman is great. I will say that I think in Manhunter, he does seem a little bit more like a sleazy, gotta get the scoop tabloid journalist.
Yeah, well, and in Manhunter, I love the recording Dollarhide gets of the journalist under distress reading the note.
Yeah.
Because he sounds like the way he emphasizes at like every word while reading just sounds like he's so worried while he's saying this. He's under such duress.
The thing is too is in Manhunter we don't see him recording that.
Yeah, we only hear it.
Right. Whereas in Red Dragon, that scene carries through with Dollarhide like actually holding the tape recorder in front of Philip Seymour Hoffman's mouth and having him read it there. Whereas we have him hold up the recorder to Freddie Lounds in Manhunter, but we don't hear what he's saying. It just cuts to the next part when Dollarhide like bites his lips off. So, and then we hear the recording in the next scene as they're listening to it in the police station or whatever. And I think that is much more effective. Since that's kind of a segue into the Francis Dollarhide character, let's talk about him some.
Sure. Well, his MO in the movie, or kind of his signature thing with his kills, are he sticks like little pieces of mirrors in people's eyes so he can see himself.
Yeah, he has a hair lip, so he's very self-conscious about his appearance. When he kills people, he feels powerful, so he wants to see himself as powerful in their eyes, hence the mirrors. He always targets women specifically, but he kills the whole family as sort of an incidental thing. In Manhunter, he's played by Tom Noonan, and in Red Dragon, he's played by Ray Fiennes, Voldemort, but with a nose. They give very different portrayals, I think, and I think they're both good in different ways.
Yeah, I would agree.
We know that this character was abused at an early age. We learn more about that in Red Dragon than we do in Manhunter. And he is... he believes that he's changing, that he's becoming something greater. He's obsessed with the William Blake painting, The Great Red Dragon, and The Woman Clothed with the Sun, I think is what it's called. It's a fucking awesome painting. William Blake shit is next level. So he's sort of undergoing like a metamorphosis, much like Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs. So that's sort of what drives him to become something greater and more powerful than he is, which is a really cool angle. And we get much more development in that in Red Dragon, like the scene where he wants to stop killing and he thinks the only way that he can do so is to go to the museum where they have the original of that painting and eat it, which is in the book. That's something that is not in Manhunter, unfortunately. I really like that scene in Red Dragon where he smooth talks his way into seeing it and then just starts tearing it and shoving it into his mouth. It's really corny. So you've got this interesting villain, but yet again difference in approach. In Manhunter, he doesn't even have an appearance in person until like 59 minutes into the movie or something like that, so fully halfway through the movie. Whereas in Red Dragon, we see him for the first time in like the first 20 minutes or so, I guess.
Yeah, I think he's shown a little earlier in Red Dragon. I like how long they wait to show him in Manhunter. I think it adds a bit of tension.
Well, yeah, because we see, obviously, Will Graham investigating his crime scenes and, like, trying to put together a profile. So in that sense, in Manhunter, you're sort of learning everything about this killer at the same rate that the protagonist is. Whereas in Red Dragon, you as the audience get to see more than the people investigating see. I like the subtlety of that in Manhunter better, but I will say that I like the further development into that character in Red Dragon, that he's more of a focus.
I like the humanization in Red Dragon a lot. I think the whole sequence with him and the blind woman is done much better in Manhunter, in my opinion.
Which one in particular?
The blind woman where, he goes on a date with her, takes her to...
Oh, when he takes her to feel the tiger.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Well, I mean, they're together in multiple scenes, so I didn't know which scene you were talking about specifically. Yeah, he falls in love with this blind woman who works at the place he does. He works for a company that, like, cuts up home videos and turns them into these really corny, like... I don't even know what custom home video compilation videos and shit like that. Yeah. So he falls in love with this blind woman who he likes because she can't see him, in his insecurity about his face and stuff. So there's some really cool things with that in both movies, like him having her over and watching videotapes of like him trying to pick his next victim while she's in the room, but she obviously can't see it. So there's
yeah. At the same time, I in Red Dragon, it's kind of dumb because in Manhunter, he meets her in the developing room, where they, it's a dark room where they develop film. It makes sense because he watches reels at his house and stuff like that. In Red Dragon, he also meets her in a dark room, but everything is on VHS.
Oh, yeah, you're right.
So I don't know why you would need a dark room.
Yeah, they would be sending these tapes to these people already developed because it's on VHS. Oh, I mean, maybe the company deals with more than just VHS, but you're right. I didn't even think about that. That definitely makes more sense in Manhunter.
Well, and in addition to that, I think some of the tension of that scene where he's watching the clips is just the sound of the projector running.
Yeah.
And it's kind of flattened out by nothingness with the VHS.
Well, yeah, and also in Red Dragon, while he's watching it, Emily Watson starts giving him a hand job or a blow job.
Yeah.
So that kind of underplays that scene for me a little bit too. I also thought it was interesting that in Manhunter, like, he lives in a house on a lake, but it's like a very normal looking house. And then in Red Dragon, he lives in this like old nursing home that was owned by his grandmother, and it's all like run down and it looks like a haunted house. And it just seems a little bit cornier than in Manhunter, especially because it's like, oh, the serial killer, he has to live in a really weird, creepy, gross place. Whereas, like, that's not usually the case. That works much better in Silence of the Lambs just because of the way they approach it and, like, who Buffalo Bill is as a character.
Think it works. Well, and I think that's a result of Silence of the Lambs. I think Radner was pulling directly as much as he could from what he knew was successful rather than, trying to make a more faithful adaptation or even, like, dissect the characters in any meaningful way.
Yeah.
And that really shows. Going off of that, I want to get into the music a little bit because I think in Manhunter, when they're in the apartment, there's an awesome scene synced up to Indigada Davida, where he's getting ready to kill the blind girl. I thought that scene was awesomely
he
scored.
turns on the stereo and cranks up the volume so she can't hear where he is.
Yeah.
And that carries over into the climax when Will Graham shows up to save the day.
And I just think Indigada Davida is such an awesome song to use for that because it's one of those like late 60s, early 70s psych rock songs where it feels almost menacing in terms of, its length and like its emotion.
I agree with that. I will say that was one of the few moments in Manhunter where the soundtrack worked for me because as a mid-80s movie, this is just chock full of like 80s synth pop power ballads.
I loved it.
I could not fucking take it seriously. It's the fucking lyrics. I'm so used to films having original scores more so than soundtracks at this point that in a lot of the scenes in Manhunter having like these 80s songs with these really ridiculous power ballad lyrics that are basically describing what the characters are feeling. It's just so corny.
Man, it worked for me because Manhunter aesthetically is such an 80s movie with its pastel color palette and approach even.
But you could still have that without the corny music though.
I think the music was good though. I like the music.
I don't know.
I like the music though. I don't know, man.
It didn't do it for me.
Strokes and all.
In a less serious film, I wouldn't have minded it, but I just felt like it brought down the tension in some scenes.
Yeah. I feel that way with Manhunter with the Danny Elfman.
Oh, with
score.
Red Dragon.
Red Dragon. I don't know what I said.
Red Dragon has a Danny Elfman score, and all Danny Elfman scores sound kind of the same. But also, like in Red Dragon, it's very obvious that Danny Elfman was trying really hard to mimic Howard Shore's score from Silence of the Lambs, which is a great score and suits the film really well. But, once again, it just sort of tied in with Red Dragon's whole aesthetic of trying really hard to be Silence of the Lambs too. But it was less distracting.
It was definitely less distracting. It definitely fell into the background to the point where you barely notice it. But
which for me, like, I'll take a mediocre score that I don't pay any attention to over a soundtrack that is distracting. Not that I'm a big fan of Danny Elfman scores in general, but it was less offensive to me in Red Dragon than the soundtrack in Manhunter. I think when there was original music in Manhunter, it fit much better. But it was just like, at a certain point, it was just like every scene just had this ridiculous soundtrack, and it was so distracting for me.
I think there's times when it worked so well, though.
It worked really well with In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida.
In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida was great. I thought the song they had with the tiger was really good. Really added to the aesthetic and the tone.
I can forgive the tiger scene a little bit more too, just because it's like almost sort of a schlocky romantic scene. So
I thought even the scene where Dollarhide is watching her go home, and he imagines her making out with the dude that she meets up with. I thought that worked well too.
I will agree less on that one, but
and I thought the ending song worked really well.
Oh man, with the freeze frame as the credits rolled, that was so fucking 80s.
It was, but it worked for me. I don't know.
I guess we can sort of talk about the climaxes of these two movies, because I think that's probably where they differ most from a narrative standpoint. Red Dragon is much closer to the novel in the sense that Dollarhide decides to not kill the blind girl and instead kill himself, and he sets the house on fire while they're in there, and he fakes his death, and then later shows up at Will Graham's house because Hannibal Lector gave him the address, and they have sort of a standoff. Whereas in Manhunter, Will Graham shows up at the house before Dollarhide can kill the blind girl, and they have a shootout. I don't know if the editor in Manhunter was under a really serious time constraint and just did a shitload of cocaine to get him through editing that last part, but something in the editing goes really, really off the fucking wall in that last scene in Manhunter.
See, I've been thinking about it this whole week, because there are a lot of jump cuts.
A shitload.
In that sequence.
Where there are no jump cuts in the rest of the movie.
I almost wonder if it's intentional, though.
To what end, though? Because it was similar to the music in the rest of the movie. It was distracting. In a funny way. I was laughing through a good chunk of that scene because of how weird and off-kilter the editing was. But I don't think making the audience laugh would have been the point.
No, I think it adds a little bit of unpredictable energy to it.
It is unpredictable. Anything. Just like when they pull up to the house and the one cop car just crashes into the ditch.
Yeah, that was weird. I will give you that. That was really
inexplicably
weird.
It took me so by surprise that I just started cracking up for way longer than I expected, just because one cop car just goes flying past the other one and right into the ditch and just wrecks. It's like, what the fuck? And then from there, it just gets so frenetic in a weird way. I don't think it's bad, but it was definitely schlocky. It was weird in a funny way.
I want to believe that Michael Mann had some intent behind that.
I would hope so. I just don't know what the intention was.
It does feel a little disjointed and all over the place.
Because, the rest of the film is so clinical and precise, to the point of in their first meeting, in the reverse shot between Will Graham and Hannibal Lecter, they position the camera so that the bars that they're talking between don't even move. Like, there is that level of precision. It's in the editing. It's not the way that last scene was shot, which makes me wonder if like, okay, here's the dailies. You have until you have 6 hours to get this shit edited. And the editor was just like, fuck.
I almost feel like you explained it in how you said it right there, you know? Like, all of the scenes before that without violence are very clinical, and then when we do experience actual violence, it's very frenetic, off-kilter, and all over the place and wild.
I agree.
And in a way, we see this movie through the perspective of Will Graham. And when the editing style through most of the movie is zonked out, you know, and very clinical and sterile.
I mean, I agree there needs to be, an increase in visual intensity to correspond with, like, what's happening in the scene. But then you've got shit like the really long slow motion shot of Will Graham running at the window that he's about to crash through that just goes on for such a long time. And immediately as he crashes through the window, he gets shot. It's so funny.
Yeah, it is funny. I'll give you that.
It's really, really funny because it's so fucking corny. And I don't know, it's confusing to me because it seems so out of place with the rest of the movie. I don't know. I don't dislike it because, like I said, it makes me laugh. But at the same time, it feels too corny for the tone of the rest of the film, aside from the music.
I don't know. I agree that it feels off. I wonder if it's just that it's aged badly.
That could be.
I don't like using that excuse because if it's good, it'll hold up. But in a way...
86 was a different time, man.
Yeah, in a way, I feel like some of that off-kilter stuff would have made more of an impact when we're not inundated in such a fast-paced media environment.
That's true.
As we are currently, so I don't know. Well, in comparison, in Red Dragon, the climactic scene
does have a similarly funny moment, but for a different reason.
Very similarly funny. It might be the only movie in which the hero saves the day by yelling homophobic slurs at their son.
His child.
Yeah.
Well, Dollarhide grabs Will Graham's son and has a big shard of broken mirror to his throat. And to defuse the situation, or rather to enrage Dollarhide enough to get him to forget about the son, Will Graham sees that his son has peed himself and remembers seeing in Dollarhide's journal that when he was little, his grandmother threatened to cut off his dick after he wet the bed. So he starts calling his son like a disgusting little beast, say, "Do you want me to cut it off?" Stuff that Dollarhide recognizes. But he also calls his son a little faggot, which is incredibly jarring in a very, very funny way. And I mean, I guess it works in getting Dollarhide off of his son, but I'll never not be able to see Edward Norton calling a child a little faggot.
Yeah, and once again, like, only in a Brett Ratner
would
the hero save the day by calling their son a faggot.
Because, see, the thing is, I can't remember if that happens in the book. I know in the book it does play out the same way, with Dollarhide taking his son hostage and Will Graham enraging him enough to, attack Will instead of the kid, but I can't remember if Thomas Harris wrote Will Graham calling his kid a faggot, and that's gonna drive me crazy because it does seem like such a fucking Brett Ratner thing to do.
I'm sure that's his artistic
It's
license.
gotta be a Brett Ratner thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, I can't say for sure. It's hard to say. I think I like the climax in Red Dragon a little bit more than in Manhunter, just in the sense that in Manhunter it just ends with Will Graham shooting him in the head, and it doesn't have that added element of them thinking like, oh, we saved the day, it's safe, and then Dollarhide shows back up and attacks Will Graham in his home. Like I like that aspect of Red Dragon a lot.
Yeah, it's appropriately schlocky for a very schlocky film, I think, in Red Dragon. I
don't know if I'd call Red Dragon schlocky.
I absolutely would. Especially in comparison to Manhunter. I want to say schlocky because it pulls so much directly from Silence of the Lambs.
Well, yeah, it's definitely aping it, but
and it definitely goes broader strokes.
For sure, I agree with that, but I think, especially in the climax, Manhunter gets a lot schlockier than Red Dragon. I think Red Dragon plays it more close to the chest. It's not very original in a lot of its approach, and it is very obviously aping Silence of the Lambs
To
the point of being corny at times.
Red Dragon was pretty schlocky, though, too. Like, him, telling his wife to duck so they can shoot each other
through the door.
Times. Yeah, that was kind of schlocky.
I mean, a little bit, but nowhere near as schlocky as that cop car crashing into the ditch or William Peterson slow-mo running through a window and getting shot immediately.
Yeah,
that is way
way
schlockier.
That is very true.
But, overall, two films that take a very, very different approach to the same story and obviously have very different contextual backgrounds to play from. I enjoy both movies for different reasons. I don't think either of them are bad films by any means. It's hard to compare them in a lot of ways because their approach is so different that in a lot of ways they're very, very separate entities, I think.
I think the fact that Silence of the Lambs was, in between them kind of dictated a lot of the changes.
Absolutely.
Some of that is good, some of that is bad. I would say more of it is bad than good, only because Brett Ratner is a hack who was mostly trying to ape Silence of the Lambs directly.
Yeah, no, that's true. He's extremely hacky, and Red Dragon does feel it's hackier than it is schlocky. I think that's the important distinction. To lead us into ratings, I want to do just a little bit of straightforward comparison to sort of lead us up to overall conclusion. Who is the better Will Graham for you, William Peterson or Edward Norton?
Oh, William Peterson. 100%.
Yeah, I think I would agree with you. I like Edward Norton, but I think he's extremely underutilized in this movie, and also as a character much less satisfyingly developed than Will Graham in Manhunter.
I think the PTSD was much better done in Manhunter.
I agree. Who's the better Hannibal Lector, Brian Cox or Anthony Hopkins?
I'm actually going to say Brian Cox, and I'm only going to say it because I feel like Anthony Hopkins wasn't really given much to work with outside of what he's already done in Silence of the Lambs. He didn't really do anything new with the character, and that's not his fault. That's Brett Ratner's fault.
That's the writer's fault.
Yeah.
I will agree with that, but I think I'm going to have to give it to Anthony Hopkins still, just because I will never not be able to associate Hannibal Lecter with Anthony Hopkins. He's made the character so iconic that even though he's basically doing the same shit that he was in Silence of the Lambs, I still just associate him with Hannibal Lector.
It's definitely engrossing.
Yeah, he's not. So I think I'm gonna have to give that to Anthony Hopkins. Okay, who's the better Francis Dollarhide, Tom Noonan or Ray Fiennes?
This is the tough one for me.
This is the hard one for me too.
I'm gonna have to go with Tom Noonan, just because. And again, I keep falling back to this, but I think the difference in all three of these are the direction these people are given to work with. And I think Ray Fiennes does a great job, but he's not really given as much to work with in terms of complexity and details as Tom Noonan is. It's very close, though. It's the closest of the three.
Yeah, I will say that I think the character of Francis Dollarhide is better in Red Dragon, but I'm also going to have to give it to Tom Noonan. I think that he feels more like the character, and he's creepier than Ray Fiennes. I think Ray Fiennes is a good actor, and once again, I think he's doing his best with what he's given, but he comes across as a cornier character that I think you take slightly less seriously than Tom Noonan. I think Tom Noonan is much more menacing, even though he spends the whole movie wearing very high-waisted pants.
I will also say, and maybe this is a hot take, but I tend to find in serial killer movies like this that having unknowns, or, you know, at least semi-unknowns, not household names, work better in those characters than household names. Just because I think household names, even Ray Fiennes to an extent, have to do so much more to distinguish themselves from the household name that people know.
I suppose
them
that's
as.
true. That being said, Red Dragon was pre-Harry Potter.
That's true, but Ray Fiennes was still a big name even back then.
He was, definitely, but I would say he was really big for shit like Schindler's List. I mean, granted, a lot of people have seen Schindler's List, but definitely not as much of a household name as he was post-Voldemort. But that being said, I will agree with you. He's way more well-known than Tom Noonan was. Who is the better Freddie Lounds, Philip Seymour Hoffman or Stephen Lang?
You know, I think I've come full circle. I think Manhunters.
Stephen Lang
did a better job. I love Philip Seymour Hoffman in Red Dragon, but I think I'm just a broken record at this point. Direction makes all the difference in the world.
Yeah, now I'm going to say Stephen Lang as well. Like I said before, he gives much more of a sleazy tabloid journalist vibe than Philip Seymour Hoffman does. Philip Seymour Hoffman's great. Can't say anything bad about him, but the character feels scuzzier in Manhunter than in Red Dragon, and I like that for the character that he's supposed to be. And last one, who is the better Reba McClane, the blind girl, Joan Allen in Manhunter or Emily Watson in Red Dragon?
I'm actually going to say Emily Watson for this one. I think she was a little better in the role. I don't know, it's tough because I feel like she's given less to work with, but the fact that she did just as well says a lot, I think.
I'm actually going to say Joan Allen for this one, just because I think she does a better job of being less helpless, I guess, which I think is more necessary for the character, because such a big part of Reba's character is that even though she's blind, she doesn't think of herself as different, nor does she want other people to think of her as different. and she is very much about like not taking charity and help from other people. So she seems to be more self-assured in Manhunter, or Joan Allen does, whereas Emily Watson seems more timid and helpless at times. Maybe that's just because there is more of her character in Red Dragon than in Manhunter, but I think I like Joan Allen better.
Yeah, I think that was hacky directing too, though.
Yeah, no, that's true. There's definitely something to be said for Michael Mann versus Brett Ratner. I don't think we need to ask who's the better director. It's definitely Michael Mann. But yeah, okay, let's go ahead and rate these. We'll start with Manhunter.
Sure. I think this is a fantastic movie. Manhunter does a great job exploring Will Graham and his PTSD, exploring the journey that he has through the Dollarhide case as he kind of deals with his PTSD, but also starts to overcome it in a lot of ways. And it's matched with such a great aesthetic of very pastel neons and very stylized lighting. That being said, it's shot very clinically, which works really well. I thought the soundtrack was actually really good, in my opinion. All the actors do a great job. They're very understated. Yeah, I think this is just a fantastic movie. I would absolutely recommend it. I'm going to give it a 4.5 out of 5.
Yeah, I really liked this movie a lot too. It was my first time seeing it, and there were obviously hurdles to get through, having Hannibal Lecter be played by somebody other than Anthony Hopkins. I really like the pacing of the movie, how it sort of plays out very much from Will Graham's perspective before we start to see more in the latter half from different perspectives. Michael Mann's direction is great. It looks really good. I like the stylization. It's a solid 80s crime thriller. The soundtrack really does not work for me. And the climax is kind of baffling in how tonally different it is from the rest of the movie. But overall, I would still say this is a very good film and would recommend it. And I'm going to give it a 4 out of 5 pods. So that gives Manhunter a rounded up average of 4.3 out of 5 pods. And what would you rate Red Dragon?
Well, Red Dragon is a broad, dumb, fun version of Manhunter in a lot of ways. In terms of narrative, it's very similar, but it takes all of the core of Manhunter and makes it look almost abstract in its subtlety in comparison, because Red Dragon explains everything to you.
Yes.
Directly. And while it's fun and fast-paced, and Anthony Hopkins does a great job, I think it misses a lot of the point of what the story of Red Dragon was trying to do, and some of like the core ethos of Manhunter. Instead, it tries to just blatantly take a lot of the elements of what made Silence of the Lambs what it was and just copy. And I feel like since it doesn't try to do its own thing quite enough, it suffers because of that. It's still an enjoyable movie. It's fun, but I was hoping for more, I guess. I would give this movie a 3 out of 5. It's a good movie, but if I were to recommend either one, I would recommend Manhunter for sure.
Red Dragon is very hacky in its mimicry of Silence of the Lambs. I think the proper approach to this movie would have been to try to do something different in the same world rather than just repeat what made Silence of the Lambs so good, which is what Ridley Scott did with Hannibal a couple of years prior, which I'm sure we'll talk about at some point on the show. But he did something different, and it doesn't feel like a cheap knockoff of Silence of the Lambs. That being said, this is still a well-done, competent Hollywood crime drama. Brett Ratner is a hack. We all know this, but the cast is good. I mean, Ed Norton, Anthony Hopkins, Ray Fiennes, Emily Watson, like, these are all good actors. I think, if anything, its lack of originality in its approach just makes it more forgettable than anything else. But overall, a still well done, enjoyable enough film. I don't dislike this movie. I think I'm going to give it a 3.5 out of 5 pods. I do appreciate some of its expanded exploration into certain characters that Manhunter did not really provide. Overall, a solid film. So that'll be an average of 3.3 out of 5 pods for Red Dragon. Next week, it's finally here. It's arrived. The moment we've all been waiting for. The Predator. It's out. It's in theaters. We're going to go see it, and we're going to talk about it on the show. Go see Predator in preparation. I'm excited.
I hope it's good.
I hope it's good, too. I don't see any reason it shouldn't be.
I have been avoiding any reviews or anything about it.
I trust Shane Black, though.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, I trust Shane Black.
All of the posters
he's never done me
for
wrong.
This one look fucking
They're metal
awesome.
as fuck, dude. I know. I want like all of the Predator posters. I'm just expecting a fun, dumb action movie. That's what Shane Black does so well. And you know what? Not even dumb. I retract that. I'm looking for a fun action movie. His last film, The Nice Guys, I thought was great.
Yeah, I thought it was great.
I loved The Nice Guys. I love the Lethal Weapon movies. Like, I am a sucker for Shane Black.
Yeah.
So
the first Predator is amazing.
Yeah, I'm going into this excited, and hopefully I won't be let down. So if you're excited for The Predator, go see it this week and check back with us next week to hear our thoughts on it. Should be very exciting. If you like the show, be sure to take a few seconds out of your day to leave us a nice rating and review on Apple Podcasts or anywhere else that you might listen to the show. Follow us on social media, or you know what? Fuck it. Follow us on Twitter. I've kind of given up on Facebook at this point. We don't get shit on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter.
Sorry, Grandma.
Yeah, for real. Follow us on Twitter at PodPeoplePod. Let us know if you've seen Red Dragon and or Manhunter, your thoughts on those. Which of the actors do you think were better in each role? Play our comparison game with us. Tell us about how excited or not excited you are for The Predator. Get at us. You can also send us an email, podpeoplepod@gmail.com. Check out our Letterboxd page, letterboxd.com/podpeoplepod. See a list of all of the films we've talked about on the show with our average ratings and links to those episodes. And yeah, talk to us about whatever.
Stay greasy.
Send us money for our Hurricane Florence disaster relief. Or don't actually send us money. We're fine. If you're going to donate, send it to the American Red Cross or something. There are people who were hit pretty fucking bad in North Carolina, despite the jokes we make. So
yeah, I mean, you could Venmo me if you wanted to, but
send your money to better causes.
Better to send it to Wilmington.
Yeah, send it to Wilmington, and
but when I go to Wilmington, I'll let you know so you can Venmo me then.
Yeah, we're going to need a dinghy to get there. Send us money for our dinghy. Well, thank you as always for listening. Check back next week for our thoughts on the new Predator film. And until next time, keep it sleazy.